So we are here talking to Abby Waysdorf, who is an assistant professor in media studies.
Yeah, my name is Abby Waysdorf. I'm an assistant professor. My research focuses on fandom, so that's, I think, what we're going to be talking today. I'm from the U.S., but I moved here to the Netherlands to do a research master. Here, actually, at Utrecht University. I was one of the first few years of the research master, and so I did my master's degree here, and then went to Rotterdam to do my PhD research. Came back to Utrecht as a postdoc towards the end of 2018, and after finishing that, I became an assistant professor here.
We know that fandom plays a big part, like in today's life. What first drew you to focus on that?
I mean, I think I've always been interested in it. It's always been sort of something that I've had experience with, something that my family's had experience with. You know, my parents are music fans and sports fans. My mom introduced me to Star Trek. You know, so it's always been kind of something, I think, kind of in the air. I've always been very interested in it because I'm also very interested in people. So, you know, thinking about people and about subcultures, that kind of drew me as I started to learn a little more about, you know, what you do when you do media studies. I grew up very much a music fan. So that was also, you know, something I knew that mattered to me, you know, and, you know, very interested again in this sort of study of subcultures. Ended up drifting into fandom. The more I realized, that's also something that I can look at.
What kind of fandoms have you studied so far? Are there any that you prefer? Or?
I don't know. Prefer is a strange way to put it. I don't know if I'd say
that you're more interested in.
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm interested in kind of the interactions between sort of fans and creators and industry. So kind of anything where I can really highlight that. I did a lot of work on sports fans during my master's. I'd love to get back into that. I haven't done it in a while, you know, because again, that's also something where there's a really interesting dynamic there. I did for Game of Thrones fans, looked at fans of the Harry Potter series, which of course a very, very big fandom. So there's a lot to do in there. And fans of, you know, an older television show called The Prisoner. Also, you know, they all have interesting dynamics. I wouldn't say one of them is my favorite. I'm going to be starting on a project soon where I'm going to look a lot more at Eurovision fandom, because again, very interesting dynamics there. So I'm kind of interested in anything, you know, I think most fandoms have something very interesting about them.
So it's not like, I am myself.
Yeah. Well, I am a bit known as a Eurovision fan in my friends group.
Okay, so it plays some kind of role. It plays
kind of a role, except, you know, the thing is with doing, you know, when I was, you know, when I'm thinking about doing this Eurovision book, that was actually something that made me very hesitant, because it is something that I'm personally attached to. You know, do I want to take this sort of critical eye that is really necessary to do fan studies work with something that I care about, you know, with something that I am kind of known, well, not known, but known by my friends at least, for having an attachment to. I think it can help your research, but, you know, you also have to make sure to maintain the criticality. I think, you know, I've occasionally, you know, in studying fandom and being around fan studies people, occasionally you do get, you know, presentations where it's like, my fandom is the most interesting, and here's why my particular fandom is the best and most interesting. It's really more that, really, you know, kind of be able to say, okay, here's, be able to have that stance to it. And also, you know, the other dilemma is, you know, particularly in media studies, do you make everything that you like your research, your work? Do you have any way out of it?
Yes, that's challenging.
Always challenging. That's always a danger.
Yeah, because I guess when you're choosing like a topic or research something, you're always focusing on something that you actually like and enjoy spending a lot of time
Absolutely.
on it.
And, you know, that's always what I tell my students, is this interesting? What you have to spend a lot of time with it. Yeah. But on the other hand, you know, sometimes it can be nice to have one thing that you enjoy that you're not researching.
Because when you research it, you may not enjoy it.
Exactly.
Perfect.
So this book, I guess what we're talking about is, I think it was fan sites, film tourism, and contemporary fandom. And it was based on my PhD research. So how did I do it? Well, I got involved in this project that was on media tourism in Rotterdam, and I picked up on the film tourism angle, you know, work I did there, you know, and then I turned that dissertation into this book.
So that's what motivated you
in general. I mean, obviously that there was, you know, this project, there was this angle in there, but I really was interested again in this idea again of looking at different fandoms, of using sort of fan studies to explain what's going on here, because I also felt that was something a lot of film tourism research at the time, you know, this is kind of the mid 2010s, was really a lot of it coming from tourism research. Didn't really know what fans were about.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to focus on that angle there. And, also just, it was, it's kind of interesting because so much of the fan studies that I knew, even my own experience with fandom, was so focused at this point on digital cultures. I found it really interesting to look at the role that physical places still continue to play in fandom.
Why do you think that stepping into that different world of film or series, like the actual world, is appealing for the contemporary audience?
Oh gosh, there are so many reasons. I think that's one thing I really try to go into in the book, is that there's not really one reason. I think, it's very easy, and this was even something I encountered when I started, very easy to say that people are really doing this to, have their fantasy of being in, the Game of Thrones world, where that's part of it, and even not always say the biggest part. I think people do want to make this connection. They want to make this sort of physical connection to something that they love. They want to make it feel real in some way. They want to physicalize it. For all that we have very much a digital culture, so we don't kind of think of things as real necessarily unless we're physically encountering them. Yes. So I think a lot of it comes around that, and some of it is this sort of getting into the world of it. Sometimes it's based on wanting to see how it was made. I think that's one thing with film tourism that people forget, is that it is a craft. It is something that people make. People are really fascinated by, okay, how do you do this? How do you get here? How do you, put this all together? What was, what were the actors like? There's that angle too. And then, I also really, one thing I talk about a lot is this role of commemorating, that this television show or this movie was important to you. And so you go to the place where it happened, and, you kind of feel that or that energy there, saying, okay, I've made this effort. I want to be here. I want to have my own physical experience with it because it was important.
Like, what do you think the rise of fan tourism says about the changes in that nature?
I think it's interesting because it's, when you're sort of looking at the history of media tourism, as my old supervisor put it, tied up with the history of tourism. You get an image of what these places were. You want to go there. You want to experience for yourself. You see the role that this particular place played in some great literature. But there's this longer connection. I think with contemporary film tourism, again, it's the sort of the physicalizing aspect of it. When so much is digital, when so much is media based and screen based and all of that, there is this corresponding, okay, what is it really like kind of desire there, and want to. It's emotional connection with the story and emotional connection transferred to the place. I think there's always been, of course, this connection between, emotions and places. There's the role of place is often very is physicalizing a lot of emotions and ideas and attachments that we have to what a place means, to experience that we've had there. And with film tourism, I think there's a lot of doing that for stories.
You describe, like in your book, different kinds of fan relationships, and how did you came up to distinguish actually those?
Well, I think the thing about this is it's very it's more of an ethnographic work. As I mentioned, I'm really interested in people, so I'm very interested in what are people doing, how are people feeling things, what are they thinking about it. So I did observation on the ground in a lot of places. I also did a lot of interviews. So the way that I kind of looked at kind of different examples to kind of see, okay, what are different ways that people are relating to these places, and what are, depending on maybe on the text, on whether, with the Game of Thrones study, that was very new. It was between the 3rd and 4th seasons. So it's a very new thing, very exciting, very, everyone wanted to find out stuff about it. Whereas, say, the Prisoner case was, the Prisoner aired for 2 seasons in the late 60s. But people are still going there. So they have a very different relationship with the place and with how they deal with it. So just looking at kind of the different ways that people do this, that kind of led to the different ways to talk about it.
Yeah, also that can be like very personal to someone,
absolutely,
depending on their background or
absolutely. So you do get a lot of very personal stories. For example, the Prisoner one, some of these people have been going there for 30, almost 40 years. They have a very different relationship with Port Mario, the filming location. But then, people who are going to Dubrovnik for the first time have with the filming. But there's still different kinds of emotional attachment, all those kind of things.
Like, do you see fan tourism deepening engagement, or basically a source of like capitalizing things?
Well, the answer is yes. It's both of these things. I think that's the thing is, like a lot of other fan practices, you can kind of point to its origins as a sort of more grassroots thing, as a thing that fans are just doing. But you could also see, because fans are doing it, there is also a push to, particularly from the media industry, to capitalize on it in the way that the media industry wants to capitalize on and make use of other fan practices. So I was interested in the sort of grassroots, they're just going here, why are they doing that kind of thing. But the more you get into it, the more you realize there is also, as this has been recognized as something that fans quote unquote want to do, there's also an encouragement for fans to do it, and to do it in more controlled ways. I think the last chapter of the book, which was not part of the dissertation, that was new, was really looking at these sort of Friends themed pop-up things, and that was very much also about, okay, how is the media industry using this desire that fans have to connect to these places, to have these physical experiences, them to kind of turn that back into something that they can capitalize on. I think that is something that we are going to be seeing more and more, is sort of trying to harness the power of this connection.
And how might that growth of immersive fan experiences reshape basically our understanding of what is like fans?
I think part of it is also, one thing that I find interesting about looking at these places is, it is one of these things where you can really interrogate the sort of the early fan studies idea, or even the later fan studies idea of fans as resistant to sort of corporate control, resistant to corporate, attempts to capitalize on fandom. Because I think in place, and in these sort of, particularly these recreated places, Wizarding World of Harry Potter, for example, or the Friends ones, you really do see kind of some of the limits of that. You see areas where fans are more than happy to be, capitalized on, if they're getting this kind of experience out of it, if the experience feels worth it. I think that is something that I do see, particularly Disney, for example. They've really tried to make use of it, to kind of say, okay, you have this attachment, here's where you can physicalize it in our parks, in our, and you see that coming. I think that'll be more and more and more for many texts. However, it does also show the limits of it, where the limits of fans being pushed can be. I wrote a chapter recently, maybe it'll come out at some point, for a handbook that really talked a little more about the sort of failures of the Disney immersive hotel thing for Star Wars.
Oh, yeah.
So I think, it's interesting because, it can be one of these things where fans are very much capitalized on and happy to be capitalized on, but it also is going to show the limits of that, and, where can we go?
What do you hope that students actually, or new researchers, can take from that project? And especially those starting to explore that concept now. Yeah,
I think the approach of really getting in and trying to understand fans in their contradictions, to really talk to fans, to really look at fans, to really kind of see what fans are talking about, what fans are doing. I think that's important, and I think that was the approach that I wanted to take, and I still try to take, is really trying to look at maybe even some of these contradictions around fandom. To understand fandom is to understand all of its contradictions. As far as, the actual content of my work, I think to take seriously the role of place, and to kind of take seriously the role of places, the relationships that people have in them and they make with them, and, what they do with them, in thinking about fandom, and think of fandom not only as this sort of deterritorialized digital screen, whatever, how we want to call it, that there is always going to be a physical aspect to it as well. And look at what is being done here, and look at how do we understand it, and what does it say about kind of the relationship that we have, to, the sort of the online, offline discussion and all these kind of things. So I think that is something to take out, is look at the kind of the different ways that place does get used in fandom today, and again also how it gets capitalized on.
If you would go back to the moment that you started your career and your specialization, like in the fandom, or when you were writing the book, would you advise yourself something that you hadn't done and you actually wanted to now?
Spend more time learning how to do interviews before you go into your first case study. I I really, I'd really thought like, yeah, I can do this. It's fine. And then found myself in Dubrovnik, like not having any idea what I was doing. Eventually, I pulled that one out. I made it work, but be a little more prepared with the interview studies before you start doing them. And that advise you, anyone, students doing interview studies, it's harder than you think.
Finally, like for students who are like fan themselves, how they can turn into something like academically meaningful.
I think, for one, start understanding what fandom is. Understand, use yourself. I always say when I'm teaching ethnography, and fan studies is a lot of ethnography, is, use yourself, you're your own tool. Use what you have, use what you know, but also make sure to engage with the academic literature. Make sure to engage with also the history of fandom. I found that really important to me, because I had some experience with fandom in the 2000s and 2010s, but looking at, how did that come to be in the way that it is, I think was really important to understanding how it is now. Understanding the ways that, academics think about fandom and have thought about fandom, and see, does this work with your own experience or not? Is there something in there? Does it help you understand what you've done? Or are you thinking, well, this is outdated and, this is not my experience at all? I think use that, really think about, okay, how do I position what I think about fandom into what, kind of what the discussion has been about fandom for nearly 40 years at this point. And then be able, again, to use your fandom, but also be willing to critique your fandom. What are people that I know doing, but also don't use it to litigate your if you're, and this is something I do again see with students sometimes is, I'm in this fandom and this, the people who are fans of this character that I don't like are clearly morally wrong. Don't do that either. If you're critiquing, come from a place of, of it's not a fan war.
Step back, see things objectively.
Yeah, exactly. Use yourself. I think it's really important because it gives you some insight. It gives you some insight into how this feels. It gives you a lot of insight into why people are doing this. Because if you can understand that, that's hard to kind of get at from interviews or just understand how it feels and understand all of that. But try to take a step back with terms of what people are actually doing.
Okay, yeah, that's it. That was the final question.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.